when he was at the federal level. There's a couple things I would say. One is, yes, I was very frustrated because if I remember how this went down, it was in 2014 that we were supposed to have a new negotiation on equalization. And somebody had sent me a report from Quebec. Quebec was they already had a position paper that said that they had a 30-page document saying how they would change equalization. And I thought, my goodness, we've got nothing. We're going into what could be a new negotiation. And Quebec has a variety of ideas about how they want to improve and change equalization as the recipient. The main recipient, whereas we, as the main payer, we don't have any strategy at all. And then Stephen Harper at the time made the decision to just extend the program for another 5 years, and it went off the table. And then we were looking forward to seeing it extended once again in 2019 and having a discussion. And guess what? Bill Morneau did the same thing, extended it another 5 years. So I think this goes to the point about that many of you are making about the Fair Deal panel. And this one in particular, this program, this recommendation in particular, is that do we have really any ability to change it whatsoever? So now our Calgary friends have joined in the conversation. You guys can feel free to text me, 403-974-8255. We're going to talk about equalization. We're also going to talk about some of the other proposals that are on the table. And I just want to get your sense of where you think the province should be going on this. We're in this weird position now, right? Because I think a lot of people are thinking, well, look at everything that has happened over the last few months. Look at the collaboration between the federal and the provincial governments. Look at how much income support the federal government has been able to give. Why would we even want to talk now about changing the relationship? And I guess what I would say is it just reinforces for me why it is we need to have more of our own source revenue so that we can take care of our own priorities. Because even through the last 5 years of economic hardship, we continue in all of the labor market surveys, we continue to have a higher level of workforce participation, a higher level of incomes. And in fact, because our premier made the decision not to close down as many businesses is part of the reason that we continue that we may end up coming out of this faster than some of the other provinces. So what happens is Alberta continues to get penalized by making good economic decisions. Our reward is that we send more money to Ottawa. And so how is that fair? So we're going to talk more about this. I understand that the Premier is on the line right now. And if you've got questions for him, send them along. 403-974-8255. If you're listening to us in Calgary, and if you're listening to us in the north part of the province, 780-496-0063. Premier Kenney, thanks so much for being with us today.
Good to be here, Danielle.
I better start off where I just ended off, because we just had a conversation with Ben Eisen of the Fraser Institute talking about changes to the equalization formula. And there have been a number of people saying, why didn't you change it when you were there as part of the Harper cabinet? Can you tell us a little bit about that dynamic and what was going on?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it was changed. You might recall Quebec protesting that the last series of changes to the equalization formula made by the Harper government did limit the benefits that could go to Quebec. Do you remember Premier Danny Williams refusing to fly the flag in the Newfoundland legislature in protest for the changes that the Harper government made? So there were changes made. Second point, you know, I never recall in my 19 years as a federal MP the Alberta government asking us in Ottawa to modify the equalization program. It never seemed to be an issue, at least emanating from the government of Alberta, because I think in part times were really good here through almost all of that period, and not so good in other parts of the country. We were running, for many of those years, huge surpluses, while Quebec, for example, was in huge deficits with much higher unemployment. But obviously, all of that has completely reversed itself in the last 5 years, with Alberta in an economic trough. Quebec, for example, leading the country in economic growth, us with a huge deficit, them with a big surplus. And the third thing, which I think is most important about this, is Albertans are not, I don't believe they're opposed to sharing some of our good fortune when times are good here and bad elsewhere. But what they cannot abide is massive and endless transfers through equalization and other programs that benefit governments seeking to block our resources, impair our ability to pay make those contributions. That's fundamentally what is different now. And so that's why we're saying we need that fair deal. And Daniel, you know very well that equalization has been around since the 1960s, the whole system of fiscal federal. And by the way, of the $20 billion a year net that Alberta contributes through our federal taxes to the rest of Canada, only about $3 billion of that is through equalization. I think there is maybe some confusion on this point, but most of that, those transfers come through other forms of other aspects of the whole system of fiscal federalism, and that's why we need broader reforms. We need lifting of the cap of the fiscal stabilization program. One of the reasons that we are moving forward with a technical study on creating a provincial pension plan as a possibility is that is the single largest aspect of the transfer of wealth outside of Alberta over which we actually do have control. If we were to establish a provincial pension plan and keep the premiums in this province, we could reduce premiums by $3 billion or increase benefits by $3 billion for Albertans, or a mix of the two. So the discussion's got to be broader than just equalization.
Okay, I'll talk to you more about the pension plan, but can you explain what happens when we go to a vote? Are you going to put this referendum on equalization on the municipal ballot next October? Is that when we should expect it?
That is our current intention. That's what we suggested in our platform last spring. We have not made a final decision about when. We will likely, it's very possible that we're going to have on that the same day as the municipal vote in 2021, a number of different votes. Our platform commits to a referendum on the constitutional entrenchment of property rights, which requires in Alberta for us to propose a constitutional amendment, we have to go through a referendum, and that applies as well for Section 36 equalization. We're also going to have an election for senators, and there may be other votes that get stacked on top of that for the sake of convenience of voters.
Okay, so then let's talk about what happens. I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say that people are going to agree that we should eliminate Section 36 from the Constitution, which is essentially eliminating that clause on equalization. Then what? What happens? How does that actually move forward?
Right. So let me say, we first of all, we have not made a final decision on the question. That was the question that the committee recommended. And it could be a very good question. We may want to consider a different approach, which is a mandate to renegotiate the formula. We'll make a decision on the optimal question in due course. But what would happen is this. Based on the 1998 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Quebec secession reference, if a province holds a referendum on a constitutional amendment based on a clear question and a clear majority vote in favor, the federal government then has a binding obligation, to use the Supreme Court's language, to negotiate that proposed amendment with the province in good faith. So we would then sit down with Ottawa and say, we want this we are now having negotiations. Whether actually they recognize that obligation that was clarified by the Supreme Court 20 years ago, we'll have to wait and see. I would hope to have other provinces with us on this, although they're really, there are 4 net contributors to this program, and the other ones contribute far less than us. I'm not sure whether they'll come into the issue with us, but certainly Saskatchewan, BC, and Ontario, we would approach them to see if they want to join with us in those negotiations.
Okay, so I'm mistaken.
But let me say, Danielle, I've always been very clear from the very top. I'm sorry to apologize for interrupting. Ever since I first proposed this idea, started floating the concept a couple of years back, I made it clear that having this vote does not delete Section 36. It does not change the equalization formula. It doesn't necessarily get our desired outcome. I've always been very clear about that. The point is, what this does politically is to elevate our fight for fairness to the top of the national agenda in the same way that Quebec has dominated the politics of the Federation for the last 40 years. So a yes vote doesn't necessarily result in an amendment to the Constitution. In fact, I think with Ottawa, that's quite unlikely. But it does give us, I think, much, much greater political leverage in demanding a fundamental rewrite of the equalization formula, or at the very least, a retrospective and prospective lifting of the cap on fiscal stabilization, which is what I call an equalization rebate that would be worth billions of dollars to Alberta.
Okay, well, then I need to correct something I said, because I thought it triggered the amending formula that you needed 7 out of 10 provinces representing 50% of the population to agree with you to change it. That's not the case then.
Well, ultimately, if the House of Commons passes a resolution for a constitutional amendment, then you need, because they need to be in on it as well, you need 750, you're right.
Okay, let's continue on then, talking about the Alberta pension plan. There's a lot of pensioners and those who are close to retirement who are saying, what does this mean for me? Am I going to lose my benefits? Can I stay in the Canada pension plan? Is it a new program? And then you get a sort of a hybrid, you get your CPP and your Alberta pension plan. How do you envision this working if you move forward on it?
Well, what we envision is, first of all, we're doing a technical study at the Department of Finance that will be released next year, because this is obviously a hugely complicated area, and we want to be transparent with Albertans about the potential benefits, costs, and structure of a possible Alberta pension plan. And there are many different ways that it could be structured. One way would be to do it completely prospectively, just for future contributions and benefits, without disentangling benefits that are currently tied up with the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. So we'll present all the different possible options to Albertans. Ultimately, we would let Albertans have the final say in the form of a referendum. If we determine, as a government, following the technical study, that will be to a net benefit for Albertans. Let me say that a lot of the discussion, I think quite wrongly, is focused on the investment of the assets. I believe, Danielle, that Albertans can be just as capable of investing pension assets as a bunch of pension managers in Toronto working for Justin Trudeau. I have every confidence in our ability to manage the assets responsibly and get a decent rate of return. In any event, it is a defined benefit plan. So as you know, the benefits paid out, which the government guarantees, are there regardless of the returns on the pension fund. But that really is not the issue. The issue is a structural demographic advantage that Alberta has. We have by far the youngest population in the country. So what happens under the current CPP is that we have far more workers, younger people, paying the CPP tax to Ottawa, which then gets transferred in the form of benefits to older folks, retirees and beneficiaries in central and eastern Canada. And that net contribution represents about $3 billion a year. So if we were to patriate the pension, like Quebec did 40 years ago, right there, Albertans would enjoy an automatic $3 billion saving just because of the structure of our population's age. And that's the main reason why we'd want to do this. And if Albertans are serious about wanting to reduce our transfer contribution to the rest of the country, this is the single most direct way through which we can do so. I also believe there would be advantages in managing that money in Alberta, much like Quebec has done through their system, their Quebec pension plan and the Caisse de dépôt and their whole system. We would have a huge fund here that would be managed out of Alberta, by the way, which would help to create jobs here in the financial services industry, high-paying jobs. And it would also allow us to invest in a broader class of assets, more diversified with lower risk. So I think there's a lot of advantages in principle, but we got to do a deep dive study just to test those.
One of the things I was surprised by is that the panel recommended against a tax point transfer on those other big programs, the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer. You said, that's not in alignment with what we think. So what is the argument about why we should be pursuing tax points rather than continue with the fiscal transfers that we have right now?
Of the 25 recommendations from the Fair Deal panel, we've accepted 23 of them. About half of those we're already implementing or have implemented, and the other half we're moving forward on or doing further study on, like the pensions and the police. But you're right, there are two that we did not accept. One was on their idea of not pursuing a conversion of cash transfers from Ottawa to tax point transfers, because we made a commitment to pursue that in our platform. Now, I know this stuff gets pretty technical and a little bit academic, but basically the way this works right now is that Ottawa collects federal taxes and then it sends money out either to people or to provinces in the form of cash transfers. And often when they send out the cash transfers, there's all sorts of strings attached to how the province can or should spend that money. And very often this is playing in areas of exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces under the Constitution. Healthcare would be an obvious example. And so what we're saying, what we were elected on as a party and as a government was that we want to join Quebec, and we are joining Quebec in saying, instead of sending us cash to finance areas in our jurisdiction, dictating us how to spend it, instead vacate the tax room, let Alberta occupy that tax room instead, and in other words, just send us the revenues, or we'll work out an arrangement where we occupy that Ottawa tax room, so we get more autonomy, more control over how we spend that money on our areas of responsibility. Does that make sense?
Okay. It does. Let me ask you about the provincial police force. It seems to me, especially in the entire conversation about excessive use of force, this is a really obvious way for Alberta to make a big difference in creating a new culture in the Alberta police force. I'm a little bit worried that we would just say, okay, well, we've got the sheriffs, let's make them the guys, because the sheriffs were the guys who cracked down on those anti-lockdown protesters at the legislature. So I'm not quite sure that the right culture necessarily exists within that organization either. So give me an idea of how you're going to approach that issue.
Sure. So we've asked the Solicitor General to do a deep technical study on the benefits, costs, and structure of a potential provincial police force. I would remind folks that this would be recreating the provincial police force if we decide to go forward, because Alberta had its own provincial police between 1905 and 1933, I believe, in the early mid-30s. And 3 other provinces do have provincial police services, the Ontario Provincial Police, Le Sûreté du Québec, and the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. So this shouldn't be seen as anything like a radical change. I think the important thing to remember is this, that this really is primarily about rural Alberta and some of our mid-sized cities and smaller communities. It's not about Calgary and Edmonton, who already have local police services that are accountable to them through their local police commissions, their councils. But if you live in rural Alberta, or most of our smaller cities and larger towns, you don't have that accountability, because the local RCMP folks, well, notionally, they report to the Alberta Solicitor General in the enforcement of the law, but in reality, they report to Ottawa, far distant Ottawa. And so, rural Albertans, you've heard this on your program, are ticked about RCMP response times, about understaffing, about the inability of local municipalities to get additional officers out of RCMP Depot, about how long it takes to get answers on operational questions out of Ottawa. And you're right, there are some cultural issues there too that have come to light. And what happened in High River in 2013 is an example of that. So I think there is merit in looking at like Quebec, Ontario, and Newfoundland, a provincial police force responsible to Albertans, accountable to Albertans, staffed by Albertans, understanding the culture and the policing needs of Alberta, and whether that's working more closely with our Indigenous communities or understanding the culture of safe firearms, of law-abiding firearms owners and their safety culture, whether it's understanding the real serious crisis of rural crime in this province. I believe an Alberta-based force would very likely be more responsive than one that's run out of Ottawa, and that's why I think it's worth studying further. Okay,
I noticed that Drew Barnes, one of the panelists, took the extraordinary measure of writing a bit of a dissenting opinion, and the main thing he said was, you need a hammer. If we put all these ideas forward and they go nowhere, you need to be prepared to talk about separation. And I went to one of the panel discussions, and I think every third speaker mentioned that if this doesn't work, we need to go our own way. You've taken that off the table completely. Do you still feel that way?
Well, I would just say that Drew was on the panel. He had a chance to make those arguments, and the panel concluded that was not a useful point of supposed leverage. My view is this, Danielle. I am a Canadian patriot, and I believe the vast majority of Albertans in their hearts are patriots. And I don't believe patriotism can be qualified. You can't put conditions on love of country. You either have it or you don't. That's point one. Point two, I don't think there's any smart leverage in making threats you can't or won't keep. And all of the polling I've seen indicates that, maximum about 25% of Albertans support separation. Very, very often in the polling, when you push that, it turns out about half of those people wouldn't really vote that way, but they're saying it because they think it will maximize leverage. So I don't understand where there's any leverage gained in making an empty threat. Thirdly, The big crisis in this province is an economic one. It's a jobs crisis. And one of the single biggest problems for that is the lack of pipelines. We need pipelines to the coasts. We do not have a coast. We are a landlocked province. And I really don't believe that the solution to the problem, like, why are we landlocked? Why are these pipelines been killed and delayed? It's because of a campaign from other parts of Canada, supported by foreign money, to landlock Alberta energy. So I really don't believe that the solution to a campaign seeking to landlock Alberta is for us voluntarily to landlock ourselves by closing in like that. As a huge exporting province that currently has almost unlimited tariff-free access to the U.S. export market, on which we are so desperately dependent, the notion of us withdrawing from NAFTA, which is what would happen if we were to separate, would be a massive economic damage to this province. And finally, Danielle, we are already in, obviously, a significant economic crisis in this province. People have seen their housing values go down. If we were to actually get into something like a referendum on separation, can you imagine how that would reflect on investor confidence in this province, on things like housing values? If people have any doubt about that, I just ask them to look at what happened in Montreal when the Parti Québécois was elected in 1976 and moved towards a separation referendum. Real estate values took a nosedive by as much as 50%. Hundreds of thousands of people left the province because of the political uncertainty. My primary job as Premier at a time like this is to defend people's livelihoods, to get us through this economic trough, get us back into growth, create jobs, and it is essential that we establish investor confidence. And going around threatening votes on referendums for separation is how you undermine and create investor confidence, not create it.
All right. I knew you'd feel strongly about that. Thank you so much for explaining the position on it. And I certainly do hope, and I think we all wish you well in getting a fair deal for Alberta. That was our Premier, Jason Kenney. If you got some thoughts, 403-974-8255, 780-496-0063. We'll be right back on Chorus Radio.
When it comes to retirement planning, many people will tell you we do that too.
At the Popowich Carmali Advisory Group, CIBC Wood Gundy, retirement is all we do.
You've heard us talk about retirement, wealth, and lifestyle for years. Now talk to the experts about yours.
Contact us today at PKAG.